Welcome, everyone, to Writing Transcultural Histories in the Ancient Mediterranean. My name is Mridula, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, and I'm co-organizing the series along with Dr. Peter Agoch at UCL and colleagues at Palladion in Budapest. Um, we aim to hold these seminars monthly, and they will all be online, and hopefully we'll have a full program for the next few months out very soon. Um, yeah, we created this series of seminars as a way to foster interdisciplinary dialogue on the topic of intercultural research. These talks are meant to move us past disciplinary boundaries or between these boundaries by encouraging comparative and transcultural thinking, however you want to interpret those words. Um, yeah, and we hope that you will find this, the fairly v a wide variety of topics that you'll be seeing here as fascinating as we do. I'm very excited to be hearing from all the speakers that we will be hearing from. Today, we have Professor Nino Luraghi, the Wykeham Chair of Ancient History at New College, Oxford. He has worked on a broad range of topics, mainly in, but really not restricted to Greek history, from the ideology of Greek tyranny, enslavement in the Mediterranean, ethnicity in the ancient Mediterranean. And today he will be talking to us about empires and the myth of the martial race. As you can see, this talk is being recorded. And Nino, whenever you're ready, thank you very much for giving this talk.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Mridula and Peter, for this invitation. There's a very short handout that goes with my talk, but don't be alarmed if you find it difficult to access. It's just a list of references in case you want to chase any of them afterwards. And so the paper that we'll be presenting today is largely an exercise in controlled dilettantism. I hope controlled. I've been interested for a long time in the relation between cultural difference and the employment of war workers. And I came to it, of course, from the pre-Roman Mediterranean. But as I kept reading, I ended up noticing more and more parallelisms in other periods and places as I looked around for comparable cases that might help me think about my own case. After the obvious stops in early modern Western Europe, then Byzantium, and finally in Scandinavia and England before the Norman conquest, this exploration started taking unexpected turns and brought me all the way to Southeast Asia. In the meantime, my case studies began morphing into something different, something I had not actually been looking for. What I was really after was evidence for the impact of the shared experiences of war workers on the rise of ethnic identities in their homelands. And it turned out there was plenty of it, but again and again, something else kept cropping up, namely evidence for the conscious manipulation and exploitation of cultural difference by the employers of these war workers. More often than not, the employers were multi-ethnic empires, usually run by a rather homogeneous ethno-class. With a striking consistency, these phenomena appear to coalesce around a set of specific tropes, which in the footsteps of modern historians of the British Empire, I've decided to call the myth of the martial race. That is, the semi-articulated notion that certain peoples, always different from the observer, possessed by nature certain characteristics that made them especially suited for the trade of war, typically under the guidance of more civilized and imperial employers. Such characteristics were sometimes, but not always, associated with phenotypical features, and in every case, harken back to a way of classifying human beings in broad genealogical groups, conceived explicitly or implicitly along the lines of ethno-racial thinking. My presentation this evening will proceed as a series of vignettes presented in what I hope will be seen as a logical order. but not a chronological one, I should warn you. I expect there will be members of the audience who can claim more competence than me on each single case, and I'll be happy to hear their comments, criticism, and especially corrections. My goal is to attract attention to a cluster of problems which could contribute an additional dimension to the study of ethno-racial discrimination, both in history and in scholarship. Also, the study of the myth of the martial race can offer a way of decentering the position of the Greeks in the ancient Mediterranean and of at least posing the question of looking at them with the eyes of their neighbors. So, in the year 1672 CE, I should say, the troops of the French East India Company had conquered the old Portuguese harbor of São Tomé, in what is today Chennai, the capital of Tamil Nadu, and back then belonged to the kingdom of Golconda in the southeast of the Indian subcontinent. The first counteroffensive of the Golconda Sultan failed, and the following year, São Tomé was besieged from land and sea thanks to a coordinated operation involving the troops of the Sultan and the fleet of the Dutch East India Company. This somewhat obscure episode in the competition between European powers at the dawn of colonialism has left a significant paper trail in the archives of the Dutch East India Company, where the Dutch historian Dirk Kolff found an intriguing document, among many others. Preparing for the counteroffensive, 2 letters in the archive showed that the Dutch had asked the Golconda Sultan to provide, I quote, 10,000 experienced and courageous marksmen, Mughals, Rajputs, as well as other martial and brave races, end of quote. Under a veneer of spurious precision, the terminology used by the Dutch was actually rather vague. As it happened often in history during encounters between colonial and indigenous powers, the Dutch did not quite know what they were talking about, but they knew what they wanted. They wanted experienced war workers. In order to communicate their expectations, they used a terminology that had been common in the Hindustani military labor market for centuries. The terms they used, however, Rajput and Mughal, were in fact soldiers' identities, not ethnic denotations, as shown by Kolff. The nature of these designations in the eyes of those who applied them to themselves is best encapsulated in a proverb documented in several different forms in northern India during the 19th century. I quote, "Last year I was a Jolaha, now I'm a sheikh. Next year, if prices rise, I shall become a Sayyad," end quote. All 3 terms indicated ethno-military identities of a similar, if somewhat more fine-grained sort, as the Rajput and Mughal bandied about by the Dutch in 1672. In their emic dimension, these identities were ultimately communicative constructs that, among other things, facilitated the employment of war workers and their negotiations with their employers. This phenomenon is documented in many different cultural contexts across the centuries. Cases range from Aramean, Jewish, and Greek war workers employed by the Egyptian pharaohs during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, to the Varangians instituted by the Byzantine Emperor Basil II at the end of the 10th century CE, and composed allegedly of Norsemen from Scandinavia and Russia. In each case, the use of a generalizing ethnic name coexists with more or less clear indications of ethnic diversity, ranging from personal names that are incompatible with the religion of the group to direct references to the inclusion of war workers of different provenance. This, however, is part of a different story, interesting in itself, but best left for another day. Let me return to the perspective of the Dutch. With their request for troops of martial races, as they put it, the Dutch were inflecting a specific idiom of power rooted in a centuries-old art of imperial exploitation of cultural difference. This imperial idiom of power is best documented and has accordingly garnered the most sustained scholarly attention in the British Indian Empire. The ideological construction of the martial races gained traction largely as a consequence of the Great Mutiny, also known as the First Indian War of Independence, in which many units of the British East India Company turned on their employers. The military leadership of what after the war had become the British Indian Army confronted the problem of resuming recruitment, avoiding to recreate the situation that in their eyes had brought about the war. In order to do so, they launched a full-fledged program of imperial ethnography, collecting information on the different components of the population of their imperial dominions in order to identify the ones best suited for military recruitment. Their effort exemplifies a phenomenon observed in sub-Saharan Africa by the French anthropologist Jean-Louis Amsel. I quote, "The invention of ethnic groups is the joint work of colonial administrators, professional ethnologists, and those who combine both qualifications," end quote. In this case, a new ethnography of recruitment brought to the identification of a handful of martial races, while all the rest of the population of the Indian subcontinent was set aside with a verdict of military inadequacy. Lord Roberts, one of the key figures in the formulation of the notion of martial race, wrote in 1881, I quote, "It is no use our trying to persuade ourselves that the whole of the Indian army is capable of meeting an enemy from Central Asia or Europe. They are not, and nothing will ever make them. It is not a question of efficiency, but of courage and physique. In these two essential qualities, the sepoys of Lower India are wanting. No amount of instruction will make up for these shortcomings," end of quote. The persistence of this discourse is striking. As late as 1933, after the First World War had persuaded the British to take a much broader approach to recruitment in their colonies, Lieutenant General George McMahon wrote in his book, The Martial Races of India, I quote, "To understand what is meant by the martial races of India is to understand from the inside the real story of India. We do not speak of the martial races of Britain as distinct from the non-martial, nor of Germany, nor of France. But in India, we speak of the martial races as a thing apart, and because the mass of the people have neither martial aptitude nor physical courage, the courage that we should talk of colloquially as guts," end quote. Incidentally, it has to be pointed out that McMahon's caution not to offend the pride of the British was disingenuous. The British Empire had long operated under the assumption that in the British Isles, too, some constituencies were more martial than others. As Heather Street showed in her book, Martial Races, the idealization of the fighting capabilities of the Sikh from West India was constructed in an explicit parallel to the Scottish Highlanders. Sikh and Highlander regiments participated side by side in several battles in northern India during the second half of the 19th century, and in British public discourse, they were likened to each other for their martial manliness, in line with a typically Victorian discourse on masculinity. And I scarcely need to point at the imperial callousness lurking under the surface of this discourse. Poor and marginal people from the Scottish Highlands had been martialized into imperial cannon fodder for even longer than the Sikh. As for the latter, the multiple and situational nature of Hindustani soldier identity took its revenge on the rationality of the recruiting officers. In the words of one of them, who was enlisting soldiers for the First World War in 1917 and 1918, I quote, "It was an almost daily occurrence for, say, Ram Chand to enter our office and leave it as Ram Singh, Sikh recruit," end of quote. But the story of the martial races is not a thing of the past. On the contrary, it is still very much with us. Last time I checked, the British Army included 4 regiments composed of soldiers recruited in Nepal and called Gurkhas, some 3,500 men in total. They participated in the Falkland War in 1982 and were included in every British contingent abroad, all the way to Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, the history of the Gurkha service is in many ways typical of the way empires mobilize indigenous troops. While war workers recruited from the foothills south of the Himalayas had been already included in the army of the East India Company, it was really the War of 1857 that sealed their fortune. That war represented the end of the Hindustani tradition of soldiering studied by Kolff. Nepalese soldiers had not been involved in the revolt and participated in suppressing it, taking high casualties. Afterwards, it was largely the need to replace soldiers from the traditional recruiting areas of northern India that attracted the attention of the British military system to the mountaineers. In the words of a high-ranking colonial administrator, quote, "For a low pay, we can recruit a large body of soldiers who our best officers consider equal in courage to European troops. Even as a matter of economy, this will be good," end quote. As a new ethnography of recruitment was developed, Handbooks for British Army officers provided detailed and impressive descriptions of these soldiers, now called with a general collective name of Gurkhas, in spite of the fact that they came from rather diverse cultural backgrounds. If the Sikh had become the Highlanders of India, in the imagination of British officers, the Gurkhas acquired the intriguing image of gentleman warriors, essentially understudies of the British themselves, as shown by Lionel Kaplan in his 1995 book. As in the case of the Scottish Highlanders, one may wonder whether endemic poverty in the Himalayan region may not have played a more important role than imperial loyalty in motivating this soldierly tradition. Be that as it may, the myth of the martial races was not an invention of the British colonial administration, as shown, if nothing else, by the story of the siege of Sotomayor in 1672. But leaving the Indian subcontinent, it is easy to identify other cases where specific cultural groups were designated as having a special affinity to war and violence, which made of them ideal candidates for recruitment in the armies of more civilized, that is, wealthier political systems. In a precarious balance between identity and otherness, the individual martial races could acquire different features with positive and negative traits. But such diversity should not prevent us from recognizing an underlying, essentially homogeneous pattern. Occasionally, the image is articulated in a self-conscious and intentional way. This is the case, for instance, in Utopia, written by Sir Thomas More, or St. Thomas More, depending on your viewpoint, and published in 1516. The inhabitants of the happy island of Utopia intensely disliked war and bloodshed. However, they knew better than to pretend that they could get away without it. When war was inevitable, they turned to a different people called the Zapoletes, the easily bought ones. I quote, "They are a rude, wild, and fierce nation who delight in the woods and rocks among which they were born and bred. They are hardened both against heat, cold, and labor, and know nothing of the delicacies of life. They do not apply themselves to agriculture, nor do they care either for their houses or their clothes. Cattle is all they look after. And for the greatest part, they live either by hunting or plundering, and are made, as it were, only for war. They watch all opportunities of engaging in it, and very readily embrace such as are offered them. Great numbers of them will frequently go out and offer themselves for a very low pay to serve any that will employ them. They know none of the arts of life, but those that lead to taking it away. They serve those who hire them, both with much courage and great fidelity," end quote. We are a far cry from the Rajputs, the Sikh, the Gurkhas, and the Scottish Highlanders. Or are we? Note the imputed way of life of the Zapoletes, not agriculturalists but herdsmen, which is a typical feature of the image of the martial races we have met before. Mind you, that image often existed only in the eyes of their employers. Scholars have pointed this out in the case of the Gurkhas, who are actually mostly agriculturalists, in spite of the way British recruitment manuals describe them. And of course, physical strength and the endurance of hardships are present in the description of every martial race, as is the most common and most paradoxical trait of all, their preference for war over any other activity. The indispensable reference to courage and loyalty finally cement this almost stereotypical portrait, reminding us, if necessary, from whose point of view the martial races were construed. Now, of course, Thomas More knew nothing of the Gurkhas and was not thinking of the Scottish Highlanders. As he himself says, the model for his Zapoletes were the Swiss. Infantry recruited in the mountainous area south of the Black Forest and the Bodensee, the Lake Constance, and north of the Italian Alps, feature prominently in many wars in Central Western Europe between the 14th and the 15th centuries especially. This was a formative period for the consolidation of a shared identity in this area, politically fragmented and marginal to the main central points of European culture and power in the early modern period. Military employment for pay in the service of neighboring kingdoms, empires, and city-states was a crucial component of this process, both by way of bringing a significant influx of revenue in an area otherwise very poor in terms of natural resources, and of cementing a sense of commonality that was also in part a projection of their employers' categorization. Sandwiched between Germany and Italy, the Swiss did not offer obvious scope to phenotypical stereotyping. The psychological image, on the other hand, was quite explicit. Gente ferocissima and most ferocious people in the eyes of Renaissance Italians, the Swiss had a reputation for bravery, going well beyond rational calculus, and for absolute loyalty to their employers, regardless of the odds. Beyond Moore's somewhat offhand remark, the Zappoletes were gens hautida dissimilis Helvetis, a people not so different from the Swiss. His description echoes closely all the stereotypes associated to the Reisläufer, as the Swiss war workers call themselves. It may be odious to wonder whether those who characterize them in this way thought of them as a race or not. There is never any indication of the fact that their qualities were anything else than inborn and hereditary. The Swiss were clearly perceived as a martial race, just like all the other cases we have observed before. Never mind that a historian of today, looking at the early modern history of what is now called Switzerland, would not even be sure that they can be called an ethnic group. As a way of undermining a false feeling of distance between us and the historical phenomena we are looking at, let me remind you that the personal guard of the Pope is still recruited in the Catholic parts of Switzerland. Phenotypical stereotype plays a major role in my next case study, which, by the way, brings home to us a point of some interest. In the pre-modern Mediterranean world, you were much more likely to be racially stereotyped if you were tall, fair-skinned, and blue-eyed than if you were short and dark-skinned. Witness the story of the Scandinavian and Russian war workers who were enlisted in the imperial armies of Byzantium from the 9th century onwards. Emperor Basil II, at the end of the 10th century, organized them into a specific unit that functioned as an imperial household guard under the name of varangoi in Greek, usually transliterated into modern languages, as in the case of the English term Varangians. We have an impressive portrait of these war workers in an eyewitness account of the bodyguards of the future Emperor Isaac Komnenos by the Byzantine politician and historian Michael Psellos. The date is 1157 CE. I quote, "Next to the emperor stood men from the allied ethne, Italians and Tauro-Scythians, terrible of aspect and huge of body. The soldiers of both contingents were blue-eyed, but the Italians counterfeited the color of their skin and plucked their eyebrows, while the Tauro-Scythians kept their natural complexions. The Italians are light-footed in battle, quick and mobile in action, but the Tauro-Scythians fight like madmen, as if ablaze with wrath. The Italians are so fierce in attack that few can withstand their first assault, but they weary quickly of keeping it up. The Tauro-Scythians are much slower in starting, but do not spare themselves. They do not care about their wounds, and they despise their bodies," end quote. Now, you may be looking at me and wondering, so let me explain that Psellos uses a somewhat artificial and old-fashioned terminology. His Italians are actually Normans from southern Italy, and his Tauro-Scythians are the Varangians, who, from a Byzantine point of view, could be said to come from the northern shore of the Black Sea, in pre-Roman times populated by the Scythians, Tauric Peninsula being the old Greek name for the Crimea. Even so, one may wonder whether at least the former, the Normans that is, were still so visually northern more than a century after their male ancestors had moved to the Mediterranean. And for that matter, what did Psellos mean exactly when he said that they counterfeited their skin color? In any case, his description of the physiognomy and psychological character of these two groups of war workers, in terms that are clearly racial, harkens back to a traditional Roman discourse on the Northerners, which can be traced back to descriptions of the Germani and Galli in Tacitus, Caesar, and Livy. Furious men with ferocious blue eyes, reddish hair, and inordinately large bodies, all clear indications of psychological inferiority, within a discourse that Christopher Krebs has called Borealism, a parallel of sorts to the Orientalism studied by Edward Said. Beyond the impressive visual image sketched by Psellos, the Varangians had a strong reputation for fighting skills and unshakable loyalty to the sitting emperor, very much like the Swiss. So strong, in fact, that scholars are happy to treat as an exception their attempt to assassinate Emperor Nicephorus III Botaniates in 1079. In this way, as in many others, the Varangians by and large fit the by now usual template of the martial race, preternaturally brave and indifferent to physical pain, endowed with an almost feline fighting power, best harnessed in the framework of a political system more sophisticated than their own. Imperial warriors, just like the Gurkhas or the Swiss. Beyond such commonalities, there are, of course, important differences connected to the different historical contexts and cultural traditions that underpin these discourses. We may, for instance, point to a distinction between the martial races characterized by order and discipline and those endowed by berserk-like warrior fury, or perhaps better, locate several case studies on a continuum from the former to the latter. Developments in the technology of war will be part of the picture as well. What I want to bring to your attention, however, are the elements of stability and the blind spots widely shared among these case studies. For instance, the suspicion that poverty might be a driving force for these war workers does not seem to have visited their recruiters, modern or pre-modern. The case of the Varangians is, however, different from the others in an important way. In modern scholarship, the physical stereotype the Byzantine authors understood as negative has become implicated in a discourse of northern superiority with clearly racist undertones. Until recently, the most detailed treatment of the Varangians, due to the Icelandic historian Sigfús Blöndal, is full of hints in this direction, including the somewhat preposterous claim that the Emperor Basil II, who created the Varangian unit, owed his personal bravery to the fact that he may have had a distant Scandinavian ancestor. Inger, the name of the father of Basil's great-great-grandmother, Eudokia Ingerina, may indicate Norman heritage, although of course we cannot tell how distant. This blood connection may seem tenuous to you, but Blöndal points out that Basil II's behavior in battle was, I quote, more suggestive of the fiery Scandinavian than the calculating Greek. End quote. Blöndal's take on the Varangians is clearly of one piece with the myth of the Vikings in European culture from the 19th century onwards. With these premises, it will not surprise you to hear that there's a network of groups of reenactors who call themselves the New Varangian Guard in Australia, of all places. Abundant visual and textual materials available online make it easy to have a sense of what this is about. Now, this long excursion in foreign territory makes for an intriguing avenue back to the relative safety of my own specialism. The ideological construct of the martial race provides an unusual but revealing angle from which to look at the Greeks and their role in the cultural map of the ancient Mediterranean. Both in popular perception and in scholarly discourse, the image of the ancient Greeks is connected to political concepts and institutions, such as the city-state or democracy or freedom, and to cultural achievements in philosophy, poetry, architecture. The list could continue, but you appreciate the point. The Greeks hold the position of a highly civilized people, actually a source of civilization for surrounding cultures. Not too long ago, scholars would have said a source of civilization for other races. It is difficult even for scholars to remind themselves of the fact that until the age of Alexander the Great, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greeks were faced with cultural and political systems that were vastly more complex and sophisticated than their own, and had a capability for marshalling resources and generating revenue on a scale no Greek polis could dream of. Not unlike the Swiss or the Norsemen, the Greeks found their way into these systems mostly as war workers. Thousands of Greeks were enlisted in the armies of Near Eastern empires and of Egypt, in ethnically homogeneous units under their own leaders, very much like the Varangians in Byzantium. What makes the case of the Greeks peculiar is the fact that we can look at it almost exclusively through their own eyes and lack completely the perspective of their employers. Unsurprisingly, the Greeks appear to have thought that the reason they found employment as war workers was that they were the better fighters. It is almost as if in the case of the Varangians, we had only Old Norse sagas narrating their feats of bravery in their characteristically hyperbolic ways, and not the remarks of the Byzantine historians I've been referring to earlier. Almost, but not quite. Herodotus, for one, was able to explain in a matter-of-fact, non-chauvinistic way why the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, the last before the Persian conquest of Egypt, had taken to enlisting Greek war workers in their armies. they wanted to be independent of the Egyptian military elites and preferred to rely on foreigners, outsiders who depended entirely on them. In light of the political fragmentation and permanent instability that characterized the Third Intermediate Period, before their rise to power, their strategy is perfectly understandable. As we turn to the 4th century BCE, however, when Greek war workers found employment in large numbers in the Persian Empire, the perspective of Greek writers comes to resemble more and more that of the Old Norse sagas. Xenophon, himself a war worker for part of his life, has left behind in his Anabasis the most vivid and detailed account of the world of military service within the Persian Empire. It is, as you know, a story of undisputed Greek superiority on the battlefield, occasionally outweighed by the treacherous cunningness of their non-Greek opponents. Constantly outnumbered by large factors, the Greek heavy infantry inspired fear in their opponents, often described with the general Greek word for non-Greeks, namely barbaroi. Xenophon put the most explicit characterization of Greek martial superiority in the mouth of the Persian prince Cyrus the Younger, who tried to overthrow the reigning Achaemenid king, his brother Artaxerxes II, with an army that included a large contingent of Greeks. This is how Cyrus allegedly addressed the Greeks. I quote, "Greeks, if I took you in my army, it was not because I lacked barbarian troops, but because I consider you better and stronger than a large number of barbarians," end quote. And accordingly, he promised them special rewards after his certain victory, which unfortunately for them never materialized. Even though Xenophon was an eyewitness to Cyrus's speech, there are multiple obvious reasons for approaching his testimony with caution. It may reflect nothing more than the self-perception of the Greeks, either because Cyrus in his speech was trying to win their loyalty, or because Xenophon ventriloquized Cyrus in order to give more authority to the eulogy of the Greek war workers, which was one of the main points on his agenda. We are back to the general point I was making earlier. We have no solid evidence to tell whether or not their employers saw the Greeks they hired through the ideological filter of the martial race. For sure, the Greeks fulfilled most of the structural criteria, and some of the typical tropes of the martial race are indeed attached to them. King Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, is reported to have characterized Greek war workers as men for whom war was peace and peace was war, very much like the Zapoletes of Thomas More. The supposed military superiority of Greek infantry has become the mainstay of recent scholarship, with a political agenda where white supremacist and racist implications linger immediately below the surface. Victor Davis Hanson's construct of the Western way of war, a fighting style characterized by bravery, discipline, and manliness, is far from an isolated case. A recent collection of essays on classical Greek warfare, spearheaded by Donald Kagan and called Men of Bronze, with contributions by an impressive roster of scholars who might have been expected to know better, adds further authority to a rather dubious line of argument. It is time to conclude. In this talk, different historical and cultural contexts have come up for discussion, and inevitably their specificity have received less attention than their commonalities. Superficiality is the most obvious criticism to which I have exposed myself. What I've tried to identify are examples of the combination of a structural and an ideological pattern. On the structural side, the exploitation by imperial systems of war workers recruited in economically marginal areas, for whom the trade of war represented a crucial source of additional income. On the ideological side, the creation of the notion that certain peoples have a special affinity and capacity for violence and war. My main argument is this: what I have called the myth of the martial race is a product of ethno-racial thinking, and some of its instantiations have recognizably racist traits. Physiognomy and phenotype are not always prominent, but the difference between the people who formulated the martial image and the people whom the image was supposed to portray seems to have been understood predominantly in terms of innate qualities of the latter. As I said in the beginning, my case studies have resulted from a different line of inquiry, and I'm sure that they are neither the only ones, nor perhaps even the most relevant. Actually, I trust you will point me to further case studies which may reinforce or undermine my line of interpretation. In any case, beyond occasional allusions, I have not tackled extensively a different side of the problem, namely the way the myth of the martial races featured in the approach of modern scholars to the history of war workers. But this is the subject for another day. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was obviously very interesting to me, and I'm sure to everyone here. Um, uh, we have quite a good amount of time for questions, so people can feel free to either, unmute themselves and ask, or if you want to put it in the chat, I'll read it out. Yeah, it might be easier if people want to raise their hands, and then I can go around the room. Anything works. Otherwise, I do have a question, but I will hold. Oh, we have something. Yes, this lecture will be available as a recording. I think Peter might be able to answer where it will be available, but yeah. Yes.
Yes, it'll be available on the Palladion website,
Okay.
where the Graeco-Egyptiaca lectures are also kept. But that's something which which if you write to me, I will tell you. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, if you want to ask a question, go ahead, otherwise.
thank you. I was curious about whether I mean whether the situation in Italy, in archaic Italy and Sicily, or early classical Italy and Sicily, might present some kind of comparable situation. Not obviously the Samnites and so on in later times are very much classified in this way by the Romans and the Greeks in southern Italy. But I was curious, for example, about the role of Arcadians as mercenary soldiers in the armies of the Sicilian tyrants, and the Hieron's attempt, for example, to settle them, I suppose, as culturally Dorian, in his own kingdom, as a way of establishing a kind of power base precisely of poor loyal men who he could depend on, against his own aristocracy. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. I don't really have a question, just an area of interest.
It's a very interesting line of thought because, as you were alluding to, the Arcadians had a reputation for poverty. No, nobody doubted that. They had a reputation for backwardness, or for ancestral purity, depending on the point of view. Of the Greeks in the Peloponnese, they were the only ones who didn't touch the sea.
Mm,
And Jim Roy has shown very clearly that employment as war workers was part of the Arcadian economy, basically.
mm,
It was a way of coping with demographic pressure, with a generally not very high productivity of Arcadia itself. There's a point in Herodotus that a friend of mine always brings to my attention, where he speaks of a group of Arcadians who, after Thermopylae, I believe, come to Xerxes and say that they lack employment, and that they had only their hands, as it were, which clearly seems to indicate that they were available for recruitment, basically. I suspect when you look at the way they were, they spoke about themselves, because we have some of their inscriptions.
mm,
One directly in Olympia, one of the most beautiful inscriptions in the Altis. Another one referred by Pausanias. And unsurprisingly, what you find there is the typical discourse of bravery
Mm.
They are Esloi, Agathoi, and whatnot. But of course, they were recruited because they were available. It was a kind of a cheap workforce that could be mobilized without many problems of conflicted loyalties. That must have been also attractive to tyrants in Sicily. The recruitment began early because one of them must have been already fighting for Hippocrates, actually, because he had become a citizen of Camarina, i.e. before Camarina was merged into Syracuse by Galon. So he had been around Sicily for a very long time, which points to the fact that there may be a movement that we don't see that started perhaps not long before, but before the cases that are very well documented. One of them gets even an ode by Pindar. But then we are already in the 70s. Probably late 6th and early 5th, there was already a movement of people. And every time we see one of them, somebody like I was alluding to Praxiteles of Camarina, of Mantinea, or whatever, of Syracuse, because he has 3 passports, as he says in his own inscription. And he has this long base in Olympia, a base of marble that carried 3 or 4 bronze statues. So whenever we see these cases, these are clearly captains. They may have risen through the ranks, that was not uncommon in any army, ancient or modern. But for every Praxiteles that we see, there must have been at least dozens, if not hundreds, of simpler war workers that had been recruited with him. Again, if one can look at with all due caution, but if one can look at the Scandinavians for a parallel, we know the names of the leaders of the Varangians. One of them became king of Norway, and actually he's the one who fought against King Harald like a week before Hastings. He was defeated, but the army of Harald had been mauled so badly that William the Conqueror, who was himself of Scandinavian origin, of course, managed to defeat him. And King Harald had been a Varangian in Byzantium. And in his case, we know that he arrived with something like 500 warriors. So for every case where we see presumably a chieftain like Praxiteles, we can rest assured that there are at least dozens of warriors behind him. But yes, the
Well, thank you.
Pagans are a good. They would be a good case study because there we actually see them with the eyes of their recruiters, namely the other Greeks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
I will ask a question to give people more time if they do want to ask questions. This kind of goes a little bit, it takes some of the questions you were bringing up towards the start around, well, you mentioned the First War of Independence, and the creation or exploitation of cultural differences. I was wondering if we could say anything about how, after racializing their subjects or their war workers, whatever it is, in the imperial system, how these, the subjects who are placed under this collective identity, or those who even, sort of internalize it, how it might affect their interaction amongst each other, whether sort of neighboring peoples interacted differently before they came under the same imperial system from, after.
That's a complex and very interesting question. I think one place where one could go to observe that phenomenon is the northern boundary of the Swiss, where immediately across the border, in a situation that was culturally and economically very similar, recruitment started later. It started with Emperor Maximilian, who, because the Swiss had been recruited by somebody else, created his own infantry, the one we know as the Landsknechte. They were southern Germans from Alamannen areas, who were basically in a cultural continuum with the Swiss. But the moment the military identity of the Swiss coagulated, it also generated a border. And when the Landsknechte started being recruited, there was a question on whether they were Swiss or not. And clearly the Swiss policed their border also because it was the border that guaranteed higher salaries, basically. So yes, that's something we may well expect. In the case, Kolff has most of Kolff's book is actually about the Rajputs and about the period before the Mughal Empire. And I think he shows that the military identity easily becomes a strategy of inclusion and exclusion. In the sense that up to a point, groups can opt into this identity and be accepted, but then certain groups try to claim it and are rejected. The structural logic is competition for resources at the bottom. You are constantly looking at a political center that is much wealthier than the war workers it engages.
Yeah.
And groups of war workers try to create a closed market as much as they can. With interesting political consequences. For instance, is the rise of Switzerland as a country. But also, I mean, the political history of Rajasthan is littered with examples where the military identity coagulates into a political identity that tries to claim a territory and then ends up in conflict with the Mughals at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it makes me think of studying divide and conquer as an imperial strategy. And yeah, I know.
We tend to think of divide and conquer as attack your enemies separately, but in fact, divide and conquer is divide, include a part, conquer the other part, usually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have a question from Anne. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat.
Yes, thank you very much. This was a marvelous lecture, and my question is way over my pay grade. But it seems to me this speaks very clearly to Alexander the Great's recruitment after the Macedonian generals revolted and left and went back to Macedonia. And I would like to look at it in that fashion. Do you think this is valid?
Oh, I think it's very promising. It is extremely promising because, of course, we tend to look at the recruitment of Persians and other groups from the former Achaemenid Empire in terms of Alexander trying to bring about some kind of cultural fusion. But of course, it was also very much a matter for Alexander to have an independent military basis from the Macedonian nobility, which was increasingly trying to carve out their own parts in the carcass of the empire. So no, it would be an interesting way of going back to that question and seeing what it actually looks like. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat here. John Rogers asks, yes, and he apologizes for not being able to speak right now. But he says that that your discussion reminded him of pharaonic imperialism in Nubia. where the Nubians who are then used in the Egyptian armies are identified as exceptional bowmen, one toponym in pharaonic sources for the area is bowland. So, yeah, another analogy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a very dear colleague back in Princeton who was
Mm,
studying the Medjay, and brought these cases to my attention. It's absolutely fascinating. Also because there, if I remember correctly, there is also iconographic evidence for the integration of high-ranking members of these military groups in the Egyptian administration. And all of a sudden, a bit like the thing that Maya Jasanoff noticed in the portrait of officers that were fighting in India. All of a sudden, they look completely Egyptian in their graves.
mm,
You know, Egyptian art is very strong on ethnic stereotyping, actually.
yeah.
And you can always tell if somebody is an Egyptian or not. And some of these Nubian officers all of a sudden become phenotypically Egyptian. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting case study. Thank you.
Mm. Oh, yes, I think it's Joachim Quack writes,
Yeah,
perhaps this is only a part of a larger image where the Egyptians used lots of foreigners in their army, Libyans and
yeah.
Sheridan, and I suppose, of course, Greeks as
Sure.
well in the
Yeah,
26th dynasty.
yeah. Yes, thank you.
Uh, yeah, Siki Lee writes, thank you, Nino, for this marvelous talk. I was wondering whether the designation of martial race was ever taken up by the recipient nation, people, ethnos, in their own imagination of themselves, and just how they received this designation. I have in my mind the case of the 18th and early 19th century Helvetian republics, which seem to adopt both the Swiss war-working history and the somewhat hostile designation in the ancient sources.
Yeah, no, that is true. And as I was reading the question, I thought, well, yes, the Greeks. Because the rhetoric of Greek martial superiority that we find only voiced by Greeks may very well, I mean, of course I'm speculating, but may very well have originated with their employers, applying to them the stereotype of the martial race. Because it is exactly true, the identity of polities that emerged in Switzerland in the 19th century, to some extent, bought into the stereotype of the military superiority of the Swiss. All the bibliography on the wars against the Burgundians and against Charles the Bold in English, Charles le Téméraire, shows, basically glorifies the notion that the Swiss had these sort of preternatural berserk-like quality as fighters. So yes, the stereotype can be a, let me formulate this in an appropriate way. It can become a charter for the negotiation between the employers and the war workers. And it can be, to some extent, a charter in which the war workers themselves buy in, and they may bring it back with themselves, as it were. And I think the case of the Swiss shows that very clearly. Thank you.
Mm.
I see Stephanie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know how to work all this equipment, so I can't
No
show
worries.
my face, but never mind.
But we hear you.
I wanted to say something about the Assyrians, for whom we have some of the earliest good accounts of battles. And sometimes we have an account that they demolished. I mean, there's an example in the time of Sennacherib. He supposedly destroyed Babylon completely and turned it into a ruin. and there's no archaeological evidence whatever for that. So you wonder what he was actually after. And I think it was his legacy, which is implied in some of the statements that Assyrian kings make, that when they write an account of something, it's really for the gods. So it's going to be effective after the death of the writer. And I think that's quite an interesting way of explaining the discrepancy between this ferocious battle that they have and the complete lack of evidence, archaeological evidence, which should be clear.
Although you said two things, that the account was for the gods and it was for the future. And I wonder, were the gods so easily deceived? Could Sennacherib say, I reduced Babylon to rubble, and the god Ashur just took his word for that?
Well, it's hard to understand how that works, I must say, but it does seem that maybe it doesn't matter if people are saying that at the time, you know, you've made this up. What the gods are going to do is continue to read after those people are dead.
Sure, but also new people will read, and they are the ones who will not know that Babylon has not been reduced to rubble, no?
Yes, but why does it happen then? Can you think of an explanation?
Well, magnifying victories. The Assyrian royal inscriptions are all about magnifying victory, about showing how scary the Assyrians were in every possible circumstance, no?
But anybody could know that Babylon was still standing undestroyed, almost undamaged, except for a few city gates, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was wondering whether that means that the inscription was dictated by whomever created the text under the assumption that it just didn't matter, or under the assumption that the sons of the sons of the sons will read this inscription and take the king's word for it? I'm not sure. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure. That's why I'm trying to get a conversation going in the hope that I will get a better idea of what it's about. But don't worry.
No.
If there isn't an answer to it at the moment, that's...
Well, I'm sure there is one, not one that I know.
Well, thank you.
Sure, thank you. Martin, you are both invisible and mute. That's a bad combination.
Well, I know, I can't work
out.
out.
No, I'm saying the Martin who raised his hand.
Oh, right, sorry.
Yes, hello. Thanks, Nino, for the talk. It's true that the Greeks are particularly interested, or kind of nearly odd case study where we mainly, overwhelmingly have their perspectives on the process that you're talking about, the creation of the martial race, rather than the other side, the side that's actually doing this sort of ethnic delineation and creation and organization into taxonomies. But anyway, I wonder if like, do you think we can see attempts by Near Eastern empires, but particularly, I suppose, the Persians, since they were the most active, really, in Greece, an attempt to create Greek martial races, or to like define Greek martial races? And I'm thinking first, I mean, the obvious candidate would be the Ionians, as in they're the first subset of Greeks that they encountered, to the extent that they called all the Greeks Ionians. And obviously the Ionians, East Greeks, would have been most prominent in Egypt and in the Levant. And then, of course, in the Persian Wars, Xerxes uses Ionians en masse in his fleet, presumably because he thought they'd be like useful in some way or the other. And then, of course, that falls apart. But then I'm reminded of this very striking part in Diodorus Siculus when he's describing the reconquest of Egypt by Artaxerxes in the 340s, I think, where, of course, we have Greeks from all over the place fighting on both Persian and Egyptian sides. And we have Argives from Argos, Spartans, Athenians, And I wonder if you think they asked. I mean, we know that the Greek sources still say that they asked specifically for the Spartans to send help, and Athenian generals and Spartan leaders to come help in their campaigns in the Levant. So I mean, yeah, do you think that there might have been a degree of martial races creation between Greeks? So basically trying to cut up Greeks and see which one might have been the belief that some Greeks might be better fighters than others.
Well, I think one way of thinking about the Ionians is like the Rajputs. Up to the Persian conquest, the Ionian was basically a by-name for Greek war worker in the Near East. So much so that there were all sorts of people participated in the Ionian revolt, yet it's called the Ionian revolt. Xerxes still had Ionian navies in his invasion of Greece. But as you go into the 5th century, all you hear about Ionians is that they are weak, they are no good as soldiers, they are soft, they wear wool, and all the negative stereotypes of the non-martial race. And I wonder if what you see happening there is what happens when a martial race revolts against their employers and then gets essentially obliterated as a martial race. Not physically, of course, not that the Persians ever attempted any obliteration of the Ionians as such, but it seems that in the rhetoric of Greek warlikeness, of Greek martiality, the Ionians disappear after the 6th century.
In which case, can I? Sorry, but then that makes me think. Then, if we think the only thing I knew about Swiss mercenaries before this talk really was that they were famously defeated by Francis I of France at the Battle of Marignano in 1515. And so, did anything happen to the image of the Swiss mercenaries after that defeat, which might have been more emphasized in France than elsewhere, but still?
Oh, no. Marignan, that is really interesting. Marignan became, in the 19th century, you can probably think of the paintings by Fernand Hodler, which you must have seen in Switzerland. The defeat, so for context, Marignano, because actually it was in Italy, Marignano is a bit like the Ionian revolt. It's a case where the Swiss, who had been fighting for everybody up to that point, try to assert themselves politically and militarily. And they get wiped out by the artillery of Trivulzio, one of the Italian captains fighting for François Premier. And in later Swiss historical consciousness, the defeat at Marignano becomes a focal point for the creation of a collective Swiss identity. A bit paradoxically, because the treaty, I mean, the result was was what turned Switzerland into what Switzerland is nowadays. The Pace Perpetua, the imposition on the Swiss to not to participate in wars anymore, except for small contingents recruited by the French king to protect the Tuileries, for instance, at the time of the French Revolution. So in that sense, there is some kind of analogy, except for the fact that Switzerland remained, because nobody had any interest in conquering those mountains, remained an area of politically marginal and with a tendency to autonomy into the 17th century, basically, which was not the case of Ionia, which was actually conquered after the revolt against the Persians. So I think this is a case where you see that thinking in parallel helps, because it makes you see things that you wouldn't see otherwise and ask questions that you would not ask otherwise. But in some ways, the differences are more interesting than the similarities. This is not a cop-out. I really think that the case of what happens to the Swiss after Marignano is very interesting to think about what did not happen in other areas and why.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't know if we're supposed to be wrapping up anytime soon, but if you're okay to stay for a little bit, I had another question. There is like a degree of sort of, once the martial identity of Ionians or East Greeks or Greeks generally sort of like arises in the Near Eastern space, which, Egypt also seems to share to an extent, to what extent that's up for debate, but yeah. But we can see that this identity gets passed on and taken up by new imperial authorities or adjacent imperial systems, and I wonder if there are any examples from, closer to us in history of the same, like one imperial system creates this racialized identity of a group, and then another one, either adjacent or subsequent, sort of like then takes it up and that disseminates it sort of horizontally at the top.
I followed you until the dissemination horizontally at the top. There, I'm not sure what you mean.
So I'm thinking of like a period where there are multiple different, empires competing, think of the 20th century. And one empire, one imperial system creates this identity for one of their subjects. And then another empire, which is either competing for the same subject or ends up defeating the previous empire, then adopts the same racialized identity of the same subject. Yeah.
I'm almost sure that the answer is yes. If I knew more about the history of India in the 17th and 18th century, I could probably be more specific, because the military identity of the Rajput seems to go all the way through to the First War of Independence, which means that it rose on the periphery of the Mughal Empire and then was adopted as a strategy of recruitment by Peter, you need to elaborate on that. And then is adopted as a strategy of recruitment by the British. It is clear that when Cyrus asks Xenophon, asks his Xenoi in Greece to recruit for his army, he has a fairly clear idea of where one should go recruiting. And Arcadia and Boeotia are very high on his list of priorities. And there again, the military identity of the Arcadians was at least 100 years old at that point, if not a little bit more. So we could say, I suppose, that Cyrus was mobilizing an ethnography of recruitment that existed already, that he was not creating for his purpose. But that's not exactly what you were thinking of. There is, of course, competition for the Swiss, and in a sense, the creation of the Landsknecht infantry by Emperor Maximilian was a way of splitting away from the Swiss populations that up to that point did not see themselves as different from whoever lived from Basel southwards, as it were, so that he would have his own infantry, clearly on the assumption that people from that area had something special about them, because otherwise he might as well have recruited them from northern Germany, but he doesn't seem to have. Which may point to the fact that indeed this kind of military ethnographic thinking was really ethnographic in the sense that, if you think that people bordering Switzerland can likely be mobilized in a way that gives you the same advantages that you would have with the Swiss, that the only reason why you may think that is that you are thinking in ethno-racial terms. You're thinking that's the same race.
Yeah,
Peter
fair
was
enough.
asking about the Askaris.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Askaris. I mean, it's a word that means soldier, I think. Asker, no?
Yes, I think so. And I was just thinking that we see, from about I don't know, 1880 through to the First World War, in all over Africa, we see European imperial states create. It's a very rapid process, and identifying ethnic groups that the famous Senegalese tirailleurs of the French army, who tens of thousands of them are recruited from Senegal, and there were other territories in the French colonies that they didn't recruit from at all. So I think it would be an interesting potential test case, perhaps. I mean, I don't know very much about this, to be honest. But it happens all over Africa, and when the Italians take over Ethiopia, the first thing they do is recruit Eritreans and Ethiopians as colonial infantry.
Yeah. The word Ascaro is still
Yeah,
a word in use in current Italian.
yeah.
And?
Have you thought about looking at this from a gender perspective? I remember my father in World War II being so surprised by women in the Russian army.
That's a very good point. Not that I'm aware of. All the cases I've seen and the evidence I've read, it's all about, predictably, manliness. And I haven't seen cases where groups seem to produce female workers. Although there must be.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
I think we have another question from Stevie.
Thank you, Nino, for the wonderful talk and everything. I was thinking, so for 19th century Europe, when they were doing their thing to Africa and India, apparently they considered it a mission civilisatrice, and they were the civilizing forces. I wonder when Cyrus was doing this designation to the Greeks, did they have this mind of we are the more advanced civilization, we are the more better organized political entity, and therefore we can consider ourselves entitled to give you the martial label? I wonder if certain things like that happened.
I doubt it. The Greeks were not terribly modest when it came to their own self-image. They certainly thought of themselves as the better warriors. Do they really say, well, the Romans were very much about their superiority being based on discipline, more than the Greeks, I would say. I don't know if the Greek mercenaries were being enrolled by Cyrus, whether they had any sense that they were on a civilizing mission. I don't think so, actually.
Right. Thank you so much.
I think we can draw the session to an end. Yeah, thank you, Nino, again for the talk and for answering all the questions, and for being our first speaker to open up this dialogue. Yeah, we'll have another talk, I think 26th November, by Dr. Henry Bishop Wright. It'll be on Zoom again. Yeah, and he'll be talking to us about Romans and Nubians and various other new Meroitic frontiers. So yeah, do come along to that if you're interested as well. Yeah, and thank you for everyone for being here and for your paper again, Nino.
Thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, Nina. It was marvelous. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Peter.